Hello, Shelby. Well, good morning, good morning, good morning. I think we're on deck. Shelby, are we on deck? Shelby's right there. You can't see Shelby, but she's right there. We're on deck. And we're working on Prep Test 85, Section 3, Logical Reasoning. And we're going to start with question number 6. And what is question number 6? So the issue is, which one of the following principles, if valid, most strongly supports Lopez's conclusion? Well, two things I want to keep in mind. What is Lopez's conclusion? And what is a broader statement which, if true, would support that conclusion? Okay, find out. First name, Watanabe. To protect the native kokanee salmon in the lake, we must allow fishing of native trout. So again, stop, you get a period, just process it. So, to protect the salmon, we have to allow fishing of the trout. Okay, I got it. And more specifically, the salmon is native salmon. Okay, so to protect I don't really care so much about kokanee, but I care about native and I care about salmon. So to protect the native salmon in the lake, we must allow fishing of the native trout. So that word native is playing some role perhaps. Next sentence. Each mature trout eats about 250 mature kokanee, which are the salmon. So Watanabe certainly lays out a position that there are the salmon in that native salmon in that lake, there are native trout in that lake, and the native trout eat 250 more, and more specifically, mature trout eat 250 or more mature salmon. Okay, I got it. Lopez is going to respond to this, and Lopez responds by saying, the real problem is the mysis shrimp. So the real problem is not the trout chowing down on the salmon. The real problem here is the mysis shrimp, which were originally introduced into the lake as food for the mature. They see how they don't use salmon again, right? They use kokanee because that's unfamiliar, but it's salmon, right? So they introduced the shrimp, and they were introduced to be food for the mature salmon. But the mysis, the shrimp, eat plankton. Young salmon's food. Okay, so you put the shrimp in there. Your intent is to feed the mature salmon, which that intent is achieved. But when you put the shrimp in there, they eat the plankton, and the plankton serve as a food source for the young salmon. Okay, the young, again, they use kokanee instead of salmon. The young salmon are starving to death. Well, yeah, because the shrimp are eating all the food. So eradicating the shrimp is preferable to allowing trout fishing. And then you're looking for a principle. So Lopez's argument is you're going to, basically you're going to kill somebody. Well, not somebody. You're going to kill some fish or some sea life is going to die here. And Lopez's argument is it should be the shrimp that were introduced, not the trout that are native to it. Okay, so let's see what we have to. So we want to justify that with principle. And A says, eliminating a non-native species, that would be the shrimp, from a habitat in which it threatens a native species, the young salmon, is preferable to any other method of protecting the threatened native species. And all you have to say is, because it sounds like it's too much, right? Any other species. But no, it's the answer. Because if that statement is true, it's fine for it to be a broad statement. It's a principle, right? So if that statement is true, and you take as a law, right, that say it's a crime to eliminate a non-native species, salmon and the trout, from a habitat in which it threatens a native species. I'm sorry, that's the shrimp is the non-native the natives are the trout and the salmon. It's preferable to get rid of the non-native species than to any other method of protecting the threatened native species. And if that statement is true, then you would move to eliminate the shrimp. So that's the answer. And I'll keep reading, but there would be no reason on the test to keep reading. A is the answer. And when you understand A, and again, all that work is done before I ever look at, all A is doing is confirming what's in my mind. Okay. B, when trying to protect the food supply of particular species, it is best to encourage the method that will have the quickest results, all else being equal. Why would you ever pick that if you actually understood this argument? It's not about whether it's quick or not. C, the number of species in a given habitat should not be reduced if at all possible. Okay, but that's not a principle that justifies the killing of the shrimp here. D, no non-native species, okay, that was a shrimp, should be introduced into a habitat unless all the potential effects of that introduction have been considered. Well, that's great, but that has nothing to do with Lopez's conclusion, right? The conclusion is kill the shrimp. So, the answers are laudable in that they're common sense and they make sense outside the context of the argument, but they don't make sense within the context of the particular argument. And E, when seeking to increase the population of given species, it is most important that one preserve the member of the species who are in the prime reproductive stage of their lives. Well, I was told no information about whether the shrimp are in the prime reproductive stages of their lives. So it's not about the stage of life you're in, and if it is, we don't have enough information. It's about the distinction between native and non-native species. And so the answer to 6 is A for Augustus. Question number 7. The argument above is most vulnerable to criticism. So I have a flaw. Now let me read the law, which is the argument. I'm looking for a flaw. When I leave the argument, I want to be able to articulate the flaw. Then I'm just looking for the words. Okay. 7. If rational choice theory is correct, then people act only in ways that they expect will benefit themselves. You got to stop, because now we're talking about theory. Okay, so if I'm a rational choice theorist, I am going to act only in ways that I expect will benefit me. Okay, so the first thing that will come to my mind is that I expect something to benefit me doesn't mean it will benefit. It means I expect it to benefit me. But this means that rational choice theory cannot be correct. Now that's the argument's conclusion. That means it cannot be correct. So now you have to give me your reasoning, tell me why it can't be correct, and the reasoning will be inadequate. But here's why it can't be correct. Because plenty of examples exist of people acting in ways that result in no personal benefit whatsoever. Well, yeah, that's because expectations are not always realized. So, yeah, sure you're going to find that I behave in a way that it turns out does not serve my personal benefit. That doesn't mean I didn't expect it to serve my personal benefit. So I'm just looking for language in the answer choice to reflect what my mind produced, and your mind can produce this. So does A get me there? It assumes as a premise the content, does it assume as a premise the contention the argument purports to establish? Again, if you haven't done IRAC, right, if you haven't done the analysis of that argument and you look at A, you may well now be analyzing each and every answer choice, and I'm saying, no. No, I mean, do I understand why A is wrong? Yeah. But even if I didn't, if I had the answer formed in my mind, I'd say, I don't know what that says, but it ain't the answer. B, does it conclude that a theory is false merely on the ground that the evidence for it is a hypothetical? That is not what my mind produced. What my mind produced is that expectations are not always realized, and so there are times you end up acting in ways that are not in your own best interest, though you intended that. C, takes for granted, which means assumes. Does it assume that people who are acting in ways that are personally beneficial expected that their actions would be personally beneficial? No, but I mean, I have some affection for C. But this is not about people acting in ways that are beneficial. It turns out I'm acting in a way that was not personally beneficial. So I have to deal with, I don't know what happens when the action is personally beneficial. I know for sure that we're talking about when actions are not personally beneficial, and that is used as evidence against the rational choice theory. So, C, not the answer, but I do understand why folks would pick it. D, presumes without justification, which again just means assumes. Does it assume that examples of people acting in ways that are not personally beneficial greatly outnumber examples of people acting in ways that are personally beneficial? I don't have a clue. I mean, how would you ever know the number of times? So, no. E, fails to consider the people acting in ways that result in no personal benefit may nonetheless have expected that acting in those ways would produce personal benefit. So E is the answer. It's as clear as can be to me. It's going to be a pain in the neck because it's E and you had to read all the choices. E is the answer. Question number 8. Which one of the following, if true, most helps to explain the facts cited above about Jupiter and its winds? So I'm going to learn something about Jupiter and its winds. So what do we have here? Winds, the movement of gases in the atmosphere of a planet. I didn't know that. The wind is the movement of gases in the atmosphere of a planet, assuming that's accurate, are ultimately due to differences in atmospheric temperature. Okay, so kind of, it's not something you typically read, so slow down. And you're telling me that winds, then they give me the definition of winds, right? But I think what's more important here is that are ultimately due to difference, the winds are ultimately due to the differences in atmospheric temperature. So there's going to be some relationship between the temperature and the wind speed, I imagine. Next. Winds on Earth are the result of heat from the sun. I got that. But the sun is much too far away from Jupiter to have any significant impact on the temperatures of Jupiter's atmosphere. So stop for a second. So that is straightforward, right? Meaning the sun, the implication is the sun is responsible for perhaps the speed of our wind or the existence of our wind. But Jupiter is too far away from the sun for that to be an explanation in the event there's any wind on Jupiter. Okay, I got it. Next sentence. Nevertheless, on Jupiter, winds reach speeds many times of those found on Earth. Okay, and they want me to explain that. Okay, well, there has to be a reason for the speed of winds on Jupiter that's not the same reason as the speed of winds on the Earth. And one of the 5 choices will give me that. I got it. A, unlike Earth, Jupiter's atmosphere is warmed by the planet's internal heat source. Okay, well, that sounds good. So as you're saying to me here, that the connection has to do with the atmospheric temperature. That was in the first sentence. And now you say to me, well, the atmospheric temperature in Jupiter, the heat source is internal, not from the sun. And that would explain why you would have winds. So we can keep reading. A is very, very, very likely to be the answer. B, Jupiter's atmosphere is composed of several gases that are found in Earth's atmosphere only in trace amounts. But that's not telling you anything about those gases and their effect on winds. So, no. C, gaseous planets, such as Jupiter, sometimes have stronger winds than do rocky planets, such as the Earth, but that's not explaining the relationship between temperature. This is about temperature and wind. D, there are more planets that have winds stronger than Earth than there are planets that have winds weaker than Earth. Well, again, that's not going to explaining Earth and Jupiter and the relationship between temperature and wind, and Earth's proximity to the sun and Jupiter's not activity but proximity to the sun. So this is all, the answer choices can all kind of make sense outside of the contours of the law, the argument, but they don't make sense within the contours of the law. Contours of the argument of the law. And E, planets even further from the sun than Jupiter are known to have atmospheric winds. That's fine. There's some other source of temperature other than the sun. So the answer to A definitely is A for Augustus. if I look at question number, well, not if, I'm going to look at question number 9. So it's another flaw. The reasoning in the argument is most vulnerable to the criticism. Okay, well, here goes. So let me get the argument. Until recently, it was widely believed. So you want to focus on that word belief, that there's a belief in something. And a belief could be grounded, or the belief could not be grounded. But here we have, until recently, it was widely believed that only a limited number of species could reproduce through parthenogenesis, and then they tell me what it is, reproduction by female alone. So I got it. So what I'm picking up is, in the first sentence, there was a belief. Until recently, there was this belief. Now, the belief could have been founded, or the belief could have been unfounded, but there was belief. And a specific belief was there just weren't a lot of species that could reproduce by a female alone. Next sentence. But lately, as interest in the topic has increased, parthenogenesis has been found in a variety of unexpected cases, including sharks and Komodo dragons. Okay. So now you're saying until recently, we had that belief about it being rare, but now we're finding unexpected cases, and 2 examples are given to us. Okay. Next sentence appears to be the conclusion. It is. So the number of species that can reproduce through parthenogenesis must be increasing. And it's flawed, and you're told it's flawed. So insofar that you don't see it right away, you got to stop. You don't go to the answer choices. If you don't see it, you stop for a second, you reflect, and you say, well, now, wait a minute. The conclusion is that the number of species that can reproduce must be increasing. And that doesn't sound right. Doesn't it sound more like it's not that the number has been increasing? Doesn't it sound like we simply didn't know at the time that belief was formed, right? Doesn't it sound like they simply didn't know that sharks and Komodo dragons could produce by females alone? That's what it sounds like to me. So if that's the case, it's not that the number is increasing, it's that the belief itself at that time, right, was wrong. It was unfounded. So I don't have the words, but that's where the writer has to go. So now, let's see what we have. A, is the flaw here that equates mere interest in the subject with real understanding of that subject? I mean, I really don't understand how you could pick A. If you're using IRAC and you have in your mind that belief, it wasn't that the number of species, it's not the number of species recently increased, because it's flawed, right? So therefore there has to be some other explanation. It's got to be that belief was unfounded. B, takes for granted, which means assumes. It assumes that because one thing follows another, the one must have been caused by the other. Well, this is not cause and effect. This is not one thing followed the other. This is simply a mistake, an error in reasoning, where you're concluding there is more of something now than there was back then, because there was a belief back then that there were fewer of those things. So this is not causation. C, it takes ignorance of the occurrence of something. Okay, now the wording is, I think, is tough. But would it be fair to say that when the belief was formed, if I'm right, when the belief was formed, there was an ignorance of something, right? That it takes ignorance of the occurrence of something. They were ignorant of the facts that sharks and Komodo dragons engaged in parthenogenesis. They were ignorant. They just didn't know. So it's not an insult. They just didn't know. Takes ignorance of the occurrence of something as conclusive evidence that it did not occur. And that's what's going on here. What you have in your facts is that there was an unknowingness, an ignorance of something. And the conclusion is taking that unknowingness, that ignorance, and saying that that was conclusive evidence that it hadn't occurred at that time. The fact that there was the belief back not all that long ago that parthenogenesis was really very restricted, not very common at all. C is saying they take the ignorance, like you didn't know, as conclusive evidence that it wasn't there. It's a really, it's a great test. But C definitely is the answer. But I certainly can see how the wording of the answer choice would introduce difficulty. D overlooks a crucial difference between two situations that the argument presents as being similar. No, I don't see that at all. And E presumes that because research is new, it is on that basis alone better than older research. Again, I wouldn't be reading these. So the answer was C. So 9, the answer is C. Okay, do we have time for question number 10? Sure, let's try question number 10. Which one of the following principles, so another principle, if valid, would help justify the reasoning and the physician's argument? Okay, so I'm going to get an argument from the physician, and I'm going to have a broader statement, which is going to justify whatever reasoning the physician gives the physician. Clinical psychologists, who are not also doctors with medical degrees, should not be allowed to prescribe psychiatric medications. Well, let me just, it's got a medical thing going on here. So the physician says, so if you're a clinical psychologist and you don't have a medical degree, you should not be allowed to prescribe psychiatric medication. Now, whether I agree with that or not is not relevant. That's the physician's point of view, and I'm going to justify that. Now, here's the reasoning. Training in clinical psychology includes at most a few hundred hours of education in neuroscience, physiology, and pharmacology. And, okay, at most. In contrast, doctors with medical degrees must receive years of training in these fields before they are allowed to prescribe psychiatric medications. Okay. And the principle, you just walk that up and say, so doesn't the principle have to be here that there's a relationship between the length of time you're in training and the ability to prescribe a certain medication? So the principle seems to be got to be tied up to the length of time you're training, right? And your ability to prescribe something, and more specifically, I suppose, a psychiatric medication. But that's, so again, I don't have the exact words, but all that work is done, and now let me see if I can find the answer that conforms with what my mind produced. Okay, clinical psychologists, who are also doctors with medical degrees, should be allowed to prescribe psychiatric medications. Yeah, but that's not the physician's argument. Again, you want to be lawyers, right? The physician's argument is not about who should be allowed. It's not about whether clinical psychologists should be allowed to do it. It's that they should not be allowed to do it if they don't have a degree, if they don't have a medical degree, right? So that you turn around and say that where they are doctors with medical degrees is not what this argument about. It's about those clinical psychologists who do not have medical degrees and have only hundreds of hours of training should not be allowed to prescribe psychiatric medication. That is what this argument is about, and A doesn't address that, but I think it's a terrific wrong answer. B, doctors without training in clinical psychology should not be allowed to prescribe psychiatric medications. That's outside the contours of the argument. We're not really told anything about MDs, doctors, right? Without training in clinical psychology. That's not what this argument pivots on. This argument is really quite straightforward. It's limited to the clinical psychologist, the type of training they get, contrasted to medical doctors, the length of the training they get, right? And then saying, therefore, you shouldn't be allowing the clinical psychologist to prescribe medications because there's that gap between the length of time you're learning something. C, no one without years of training in neuroscience, physiology, and pharmacology should be allowed to prescribe psychiatric medication. I mean, how do you not pick that? Since that's exactly what the argument directed you to in terms of what distinguishes the MD who is able to prescribe stuff from the clinical psychologist who the argument is should not be able, and what distinguishes them? The years of training, and more specifically in neuroscience, psychology, and pharmacology. And so so I'll keep reading, but C would definitely be the answer. D, the training in neuroscience, physiology, and pharmacology required for a medical degree is sufficient for a doctor to be allowed to prescribe psychiatric medications. Well, that clearly is an accurate statement, but it's not the principle justifying the physician's argument, because the physician's argument, again, is we don't want clinical psychologists prescribing medications. So you're losing the issue when you pick D. E, clinical psychology should receive years of training in neuroscience, physiology, and pharmacology. Well, maybe they should, or maybe they shouldn't. That argument, that's only relevant to that in whether eventually they would be able to prescribe medication. And even here, that's not the issue. The issue is why they should not be allowed to prescribe the medications. So the answer to question number 10 is C, the Caligula.